everyone. Hello. Is Zdravo or something like this, right? Yes. I think. That's all I know actually. And Huala or something I can. That's all. Um, so I'm Heitor Lessa or Heitor. If you are Serbian, you can pronounce my name perfectly, or Spanish, or Italian, or French. I'm from Brazil originally, so that's why you probably can see my accent. If you see some Irish accent, it's because I learned English there. It's weird, I know. But here's my contact details. Feel free to reach out to me if you have questions about AWS or serverless per se. My role is a bit too long, but essentially what I do is I help customers implement serverless in production on AWS, be that small scale, global scale, or help them define serverless strategies. So if you are a company with like thousands of employees and you want to modernize the entire engineering team, that's what I normally do. Um, but normally, before I actually even get you there, just kind of a housekeeping. So this is the website you can use to ask questions. We'll go through them at the end. Otherwise, I know I can go through the website and probably answer that too. Otherwise, again, if you prefer, my Twitter is over there. Yeah, just don't send me emails. I barely respond to it, just too many, because of AWS, not because of you. And Twitter is over here. So my DMs are open. I'm happy to talk about anything but Brazil football. Cool. That's why I wanted you to see the laugh. All right, so setting some expectations, things I'm not going to cover. This is not an introduction to GraphQL or AWS tooling per se or the developer experience. If you are interested for that talk, you can talk to organizers and I can do live coding next year, showing all the tools at once. This is more of me trying to show you how I learned JavaScript early in January. And it was actually a pretty cool experience. So this is my first JavaScript conference ever, and also speaking ever in this JS community, of course. So thanks for having me. When I was talking to my peers, my world is all backend distributed systems and all those things. But I don't really have so many people around JavaScript and frontend around me. So I was asking around, so what if I decide to actually build a more complete demo rather than an API that people can call via curl? People, yeah, it's gonna take you a while, and maybe you need to hire some designers. Like, but what if I learn design? It's like, you need a degree, man. It's not gonna work. And what about frontend? Too easy. Like, too easy? Okay, maybe I'll give it a try. So I thought maybe I could build a to-do app. Everyone builds a to-do app, right? Super easy. Create, update, read, delete. So I tried that. It couldn't work. It's like, okay, now I'm going to try something more difficult that maybe I will pick up. So I tried airline instead. Why? No idea. Why not? So this talk is all about how I learned everything and kind of show you both of the backend sides. The front end, you probably already know it. And then show some of the issues I had with something called CSS. You probably know it. But it was really fun. So anyway, before anything, there's a lot of talk about serverless. I'm not going to introduce serverless per se, but from an AWS perspective, when we say serverless, not only about the scale to zero, the management side of things, but think of it more of a spectrum. When you work with enterprises with a lot of legacy, for instance, I work on a day-to-day basis, it's very rare to see people going from the very virtual machine world straight to serverless. Some of them can, others usually go into a ladder. They go to managed databases first, and then they move into something else. Lots of open source everywhere, and messaging around. But it's just to show you that serverless is the far right that you go, that's serverless. The far left that you go is kind of something else, VMs. Okay. And one thing that was really interesting, I was asking on Twitter as well. So what do you actually mean by full stack? Because everyone I was like, full stack is what? It's like deploy a full stack? Is that what it is? So some people say, wow, full stack is a person who develops the front end and the back end. I was like, cool, but what about ops? Is that ops full stack as well? I come from an ops background and I learned to code afterwards. Do we include ops within this full stack? I mean, you cannot simply develop something and let somebody else run for you, right? That is not full stack to me. So someone said, well, what about full stack builders? Like, yeah, makes sense. But what about builder? Isn't that what we actually do? Be there a developer or ops or someone else, as long as you're building something, whether you actually get that advanced or backend or front end, you are actually building something. So to me, that's what full stack is, or better saying it to me was in the front end, was changing things all the time to see if that would work, especially CSS. But I made it, ish. One thing as well which was difficult is imagine all you see is Unix shell. Everything is black terminal. And then all of a sudden I have to come up with colors or ideas. It's like, do I pay someone to help me or should I find something? I found so many cool tools on the internet that these were the three that I used the most. The first one, there's something called Dribble, which is pretty awesome website. If you're coming from the front end, you know it. It's a kind of a second house. But I found that everything in Dribble to me was like, wow, this is way too perfect, way too difficult. I can't see someone coding like that. I can't even position a menu on the left-hand side. How do I do something like that? So collection UI was pretty cool because I could say something like airline or hotel, and it would give me a bunch of designs. Some of them were kind of impossible to me. Some of them were like, well, okay, that's feasible. And this, I tried to use Adobe Colors and a bunch of other websites people told me to use. It was so hard. I didn't even know like the colors. It was primary color, by the way, so I didn't know these things. So colors is all I do is press spacebar and it generates the color for me. And then I select my primary color, secondary color, and then it just matches like heaven. And then this was, I got all these ideas from Collection UI and a bunch of others, and I thought, okay, but where do I even start? How do I visualize every possible idea that I've seen? I mean, should I just copy everyone's idea or should I just try something? Someone told me in a company and said, well, why don't you set up a mood board, like to show I'm happy or unhappy? It's like, no, it's just, so you put a lot of ideas in here and then it's easy for you to like overlay and kind of have an idea where to go. It's like, okay, I got it. And then the next one was, oh, you need to do your design system. Like design system, oh my God, another thing to learn. What is that? So I did a bit of research and I found this. I bought a license for an app called Sketch, which was perfect. White canvas, everything I could possibly do, except I didn't know how to use it. I was like, okay, I bought it. And then this gave me this design system, which initially was a bit weird, then I understood what it was. With this design system, with icons and colors and a bunch of these things, if you actually already have your colors, you just download this Material.io design plugin for Sketch, and it generates all your icons and everything else within those colors. It's perfect. So I say, okay, so let's try it. This is what I came up with for the first time. Some of you are gonna see, oh, some of this is never gonna work in UX. Yeah, I wasn't expecting to work. I was just trying to have an idea, because again, I couldn't position things anywhere on the web. So I thought, let's design it first. So I thought for one day I did one piece, and then 1 week to build another one, and then I built other pieces, and then I started to become super happy. It's like, wow, I'm a designer already. Look at that. I can design these things. But then the hard question I didn't want to answer was like, how do I create this now in HTML, CSS? And then I asked some people, so how do you use for CSS? Is that still Bootstrap and then jQuery? Then people just looked at me like this. Like, what have I said something wrong? So no, you have to use some more modern tools. Like, okay. So, okay, here's my idea now for prototyping. I started researching a lot, and I found there's a massive direction to use React. I tried, I couldn't. Sorry, it was really hard for me. Like I can't understand it. So I thought other options, and people say no, either is React or is by hand. I was like, wow, there's got to be another way. Seriously. So here's what I came up with. From a backend perspective, I started picking up the tools I would need to do something. So I picked Vue.js. To me, it was the easiest to start, and also easier to actually grow into something more complex afterwards. I'm not going to say it's the best framework in the world because some people will be mad at me, because it is. But I also got something called Quasar Framework, who like saved me like weeks or months of work from UI, UX, all those components that I wanted to now go from design to something like web. And then everything else is like classic to me, which I will explain to you over time. With that in mind, I thought, well, it can't be that hard. I'm gonna block 2 days of my week and I'm gonna do this. Didn't work. Took me a month to come up with something like this. This is what it is right now. This is the transporting to HTML. Even doing some UX journey, as people call it. I love that idea. Like, this is awesome for many things. This wasn't clear, now made it a big red button. Now I know it's a button. And then I got into a big discussion on something called Discord. People saying you cannot use a button as a div. I was like, what the heck? More stuff to learn. But anyhow, so this is what it looks like now. You should be able to search for a flight, see a list of flights, and then you pay for that using Stripe. And then if you paid successfully for a flight, and if your flight's confirmed, you get points. Easy-ish, right? So how did I do all of this? The rest now is the whole story on how we went from JSON to something like this. All right, so data modeling first. Coming from backend, super easy. Open up an editor and start creating some ideas of what the data should look like. Having the design already in place, it was kind of easy to think, oh, I need a departure here, I need time, I need something else in here. And then I start using with booking data and then loyalty data. Loyalty is the simplest. You can see how excited I was at the beginning with so much data I wanted to use. And then I was like, yeah, I need to keep it low. I need to lower the scope. I need to make it easier now. So when I got this, I thought, all I need to do next is to find all the airports, fit into this JSON, and start playing with the front end, right? How hard could it be? Do you have any idea how many airports there are in today? Like, seriously? So I thought, wow, it's gonna be like 1,000 maybe, right? It's gonna be something like that. Reality is roughly 40,000 airports. So I thought, okay, that's not that hard. All I can do is just, start filtering everything that's a large airport, international airport, right? Then my JSON will be light. Turns out my JSON for the front end was 32,000 lines. Which is like, I don't think I can load this into the browser. It's gonna break something. Obviously, it didn't. And then I got into something else. In backend, you use the database or use event-driven. There's a bunch of different ways to use persistence as well, or queues in general. But in front end, I was like, how do I do this? Do I create a big dictionary and just make it work? Just create a library, use a database? What do I do? In Vue.js, there's something magical called Vuex, which is, if you've never seen it, is like, what was that code in React? Is Redux? See, I'm getting the names. I just don't know how to use them. So essentially, all it does is it controls all the states, and then what I'm using the most is called actions, which I'm actually calling the APIs. Once I get the data, I can mutate within this thing, and then my components just use this entire store. I come from backend. What did I do? Let's copy the same ideas from backend to frontend. And then I came up with this. Don't mind about some CloudFront distributions or CDN stuff. It's just not important right now. But you get the front end, and I had the idea of the JSONs from being a catalog and a booking, a loyalty, and profile. So I started creating those components within my front end. And then it became quite clear that each of those would call an API, and I would be able to handle state from there. So the next steps were, how do I add authentication to this from a front-end perspective? I know how to develop that stuff on the back end. So there's something on AWS called AWS Amplify, which I showed before. It's a CLI that you install it. That handles both of the front-end hosting, some of those high-order components, but it also handles some of the backends. If I install this CLI and this to Amplify in it to initialize my project, I choose Visual Studio Code, all my developed stuff. When I do Amplify authentication add, what essentially does is it creates an OpenID provider infrastructure for you. In this case, we're using Amazon Cognito, but it could also be Auth0 or it could be something else as well. The idea is that web app now, you have to register or have to add a username and password, and then you should be able to call those APIs. And then the next bit was, how do I create these things in UI? I initially tried to do everything by hand, and I didn't know that in frontend there's something called HOC, high order component. When I saw this, like, everything's much easier now. Just install these packages, and I get all of these nice UIs done for me. And essentially, there was one for Amplify to add all the user login, sign up, recover password, MFA, all of those things for me. So now we've got the UI that you've seen it before, using Quasar for UI, Vue.js, Amplify for pretty much orchestrating everything, Stripe for payments, and for Auth we're using Amazon Cognito. The next piece is my favorite, or the easiest piece ever, which is API. How do I build an API for all of that? I come from REST, which is so easy to use. But then I noticed that in the front-end community, there's a lot of people using GraphQL for a lot of things. So I thought I would learn it and give it a try as well. The same JSON that you saw it, this is what we call GraphQL types. Basically, a type would actually tell you how the data should be represented. It's so cool because I can specifically say, I want the flight data, but I only want the airport, arrival airport code or departure or something else, which is much cleverer than REST from that perspective because the data kind of controls the UI for me, and I only fetch what I actually need versus REST, which I will need slash fetch flight by schedule fetch flight by something else. Same with booking and loyalty and things like this. But this is kind of at the basics. This would help me with having a representation of the data. How do I create, update, read, and delete these things? This is how I came up with. In Amplify, there's something called GraphQL Transformer, which basically is an annotation for GraphQL, or actually a directive, which creates a database using NoSQL, in this case DynamoDB, but it could be something else. And it basically, that will create a mutation inquiry for create booking, update booking, delete booking, and list bookings with pagination, everything I need. So that was actually pretty easy for me to do that using that particular tool. But I also did it by hand so I could see what resolvers and all those GraphQL terminologies would actually look like. But this wasn't enough. If you notice, there's something called inbound flight and outbound flight. That means I need to fetch the data from the flight table. So how do I do this? So there are a bunch of different ways. I chose to use the easiest route, which is called connection. By doing this on your schema in your GraphQL, that will basically fetch the data from flight databases using the ID. So if I'm just doing list bookings, for instance, that would show all the flights for that particular booking, and that will make 2 queries at the same time for booking data and from flight data. But this is kind of okay. What if I want to do authorization? What is the point of adding authentication to your app? You want to make sure you authorize the right people to see the right things. So how do you authorize it? It may not be perfect to see from the back, but how do you do it is you have another directive called @auth, which you specify rules. That's an array where you say, allow anyone who's part of the group admin, so you get a JWT token, and then as long as you have that claim group admin, you should be able to access anything inside. But if the owner of that booking tries to access this, they should be able only to read and update, not delete their own booking, for instance. When you translate all of that into an architecture diagram, essentially that looks like this. It cannot be much simpler than that. You need a GraphQL server to actually interpret that schema, create those tables, run those queries and mutations, subscriptions, and everything else that GraphQL gives you. It's pretty handy, and essentially every time I make a call to AppSync, my GraphQL server, there's going to be a resolver that handles all my compute. There has to be something that fetches the data from a database, could be Elasticsearch, could be a HTTP endpoint, could be anything. Just by running the model, that will create that for me already. The next piece is payment. How would I handle payment? Thanks to Alec in the room here, so I appreciate your help on that. Enabling payment was easy. The difficult piece was, if you look at the payment details, to make it look like it's part of my own app and not Stripe or iframe or something else, that was like seriously a hard work. What we actually do here, there's something called Stripe Elements, which handles all the payment transactions for you. And all of this actually card number and all these pieces behind is actually an iframe. It helps a lot in PCI data because they're actually doing all the PCI compliance, and I'm still getting the benefits of doing all of this. And then you have to do something more interesting, which is you capture all the form data and you tokenize all the card data. So then the payment processor, be Stripe, be PayPal, be whatever, they can handle that card details in a safe way. So how you actually do using Stripe, it could be easier. I love this thing called async await that you guys developed. Like, this is like, neat. No more callbacks. Jesus Christ. That was hard. So now I have await Stripe create token, and you pass the information that you captured from the form, and that creates an object where Stripe will be able to process that safely. Like, today is so much easier than doing that beforehand. But this is primarily actually capturing all the data from the front end, and sending that to Stripe, you need to call an API with Stripe in order to do this. And this is the backend implementation. And that's part of Alex's code as well. So I'm just kind of stealing his job in here. What you actually can do here is there's a service in AWS called Lambda, but again, it's any serverless function can do, where I have a REST API on top of Stripe. So if I want to switch between payment processors or payment providers, I can easily do that. And what my Lambda in particular does is it calls stripe.charges.create, and I pass everything that I capture from that tokenized data. And as simple as that. It may look like magic, but that's pretty much it. The nice bit about this is both of their API and actually the Lambda function, they can handle easily 1,000 concurrent payments without having any issues whatsoever, just by calling this 1,000 times concurrently. So that was super easy from the serverless side. Kind of before we go into something much deeper now, this is kind of the summary. I started with the UI UX, and I chose Vue.js, again, best framework. And then you have, I know you're listening, so that's good. And then you have Quasar for UI UX, Amplify for managing all those infrastructure bits I needed, the API definitions, Cognito for auth, AppSync for managed GraphQL, API Gateway for REST, and GraphQL, obviously my biggest loving thing now, and DynamoDB because it was the easiest thing for me to work with. So this is where I've seen most people stop, and I was asking the questions for these so-called full-stack developers, like, nice, what do you do next? Do you stop here? Do you hand that to somebody else? Or do you continue there? And most of the conversations were, yeah, that's my job. I stopped there. I was like, okay, but how do you deploy these things? How do you go from here? So this is actually where my land is. Like, this is my favorite piece. How do you actually do some of the operations? I'm going to show you the basics first, and then we go deeper and deeper and deeper. The first one is you could do some CI/CD. You could do from Travis CI, from pretty much everything else. In this case, because I'm using AWS Amplify, it's much easier for me to do this. What I do is I point that to a GitHub, and then I connect a branch. So I do feature branch deployments, and it handles TLS certificates, custom domains, all the kind of the basics piece. Nothing really complicated. The piece that's actually interesting for most people, in case you've never seen it, is this. How do you make sense of that thing as it's growing and growing and growing, right? From the front end, it looks nice in UX, but how do you make sense if a payment failed? Which customer, which booking, which flight? How do you even handle something like this? As you start working on distributed systems, it's quite hard to figure out exactly where something is happening. In some cases, if your scale is too big, you probably don't see the problem ever again. So tracing or distributed tracing is the art of actually passing a header that you can add annotations to it. I will show you live so you can have a better idea what it is if you have never seen it. But this is how everything I showed you from the UI represents from the backend side of things. But you don't stop there. That's kind of how you're starting to get interesting piece. The next piece I saw is I was asking everyone, how do you do structure logging in JavaScript? So I got told, I think it was a library called Pinna or something like this, where it would help you to do that sort of thing. Tracing is amazing, but it has one possible flaw. You're sampling requests. You don't want to get every single request traced, because otherwise it's too much data to it. So tracing is helpful when you kind of have an idea that something's going on, then you go and look into it. But there's a chance you might lose that data. Instead of doing console.log, which you could definitely do, this is kind of a more structured approach. Not only AWS Cloud, not only using Amazon CloudWatch, but Loggly, Elasticsearch, Kibana. You've probably seen many hundreds of logging platforms. If you log as JSON, for instance, each of those keys, you should be able to search on them, use and, with, or do anything you want. An example, I highlighted booking as a service, which I could say, show me everything that's a booking service, and all the operations that were cancel booking. From here, I can capture what was the request ID to every database or every correlation ID that happened across hundreds of functions as well. So just by structuring your logs, just by having a JSON, some of the JSON keys that always repeat, it makes it so much easier for debugging afterwards as well. Let's get to the complicated part. Now that you've got everything and you are almost an expert on everything AWS, how do you bring all that stuff together from an architecture piece? I'm happy to go back if you want to take a picture, so don't worry. I'm paying attention. Catalog is the fact that I should be able to search for a flight. When I do a fetch flight from that button, that calls a Vue.js action. Again, love it. And then that calls AppSync, and the AppSync calls directly a database. If you've never seen it, don't get too close to this VTL thing. It's gonna be too hard at first. That's called Apache Velocity. It's a template language that you use, but you could very well just use a function from here. It's much easier. And then next, you need to pay that, right? So the payments for actually pre-authorizing a payment, every time they click in agree and pay now, before I even start the booking process, I just call his API, thanks Alec, that will pre-authorize that, and as long as the pre-authorization works, then I can start the nice piece. The booking process is where things get a little bit more complex. Booking is the biggest service we have. For booking, normally what would you need to do? You need to reserve a flight seat. You need to make sure the payment is in place. If you pre-authorize, you need to make sure you collect that payment after it's confirmed. And if everything goes wrong, you need to roll back every transaction you've done so you got to a clean state. How would you do this? I've heard React folks know this by heart, so this may not be something new for you. We're using something called step functions, which is a state machines as a service, but it could be anything else. This translates to this, if you've never seen it. That's called Saga in microservices. What the Saga does in this case is I have my happy path on the right. So if everything goes correctly and smooth, I should be able to reserve a flight, booking, collect payment, confirm booking, and do a notification for the customer. However, if something goes wrong along some of these steps, I should be able to roll back exactly where it's supposed to be. If I'm able to collect the payment, but I cannot confirm booking, maybe my database is offline, something happened, I should be able to refund that payment that I collected, and then go back and set that booking as canceled instead of actually reserved, and I release that flight seat, and I tell everyone, hey, it failed. But the most common mistake in distributed systems is not having something like this. This means that failed, I roll back exactly where it's supposed to be, but how do I know what caused the failure? I should be able to have that in my queue so I can put that transaction back in case that was something that was like transit issue or something. So that Saga is, in a nutshell, the easiest way to explain is every transaction you have should have an associated transaction to roll back to get back to where it's supposed to be. Ready to go more complex? Okay, no. Now it's getting easier now, to be honest. So once you list the bookings, you remember that the booking has a flight. And then that flight once you click in the booking, it shows the flight details from that particular booking. But remember that flight details is on a flight database. So once I make that Vue.js, list bookings, and get the booking data, GraphQL knows that it also has a reference to the flight one, and it goes to the catalog and fetch the flight too. Everything is in parallel, or in this case it would be sequential, but still, who cares? Next is initially what was supposed to be the easiest, but I'm happy to answer I'm happy to answer questions if it's too complex. Here, we fetch the loyalty from AppSync, and then between APIs, I do a cryptographic hashing for a proper security instead of using JWT here. And then this API calls another Lambda that fetches the loyalty data for me. Until here, it's fine. But how do you calculate points as soon as a booking has been confirmed? We could do this all using synchronous calls, or we could use messaging. Yet another AWS service, I know, but it's essentially anything that's pub/sub or event-driven for you. Once a booking has been confirmed, so my booking Lambda function on my compute writes that to Dynamo. Once that's confirmed, it publishes a message to a topic that basically says, hey, I've got a booking confirmed. Whoever needs to know, it's there. These fellows here, they subscribe to this topic and say, all I want to know if a booking has been confirmed, I get a JSON, write that to Dynamo, calculate the points, job done. Easy-ish. Not easy yet. Everything you've learned looks like this. Now I've got a bunch of functions everywhere. You've got a bunch of supporting services to help maintaining those pieces and operating those pieces. But you also got the payment piece, AppSync going to catalog to fetch the flights. Once I fetch the flights, I pay that first. And once I pay, I kick off my booking. And once booking is kicked off, I go to loyalty and compute my points. Cool. Let's have a quick look into how that looks like. Let's see how much time I have. I think I should be okay. I have 5 minutes left. Oh, and by the way, don't let me fool you. That's not something I did in 1 week. Like special CSS, it took me 5 hours to figure out one thing. So that I did all of this live on Twitch in 14 hours as well. If you're interested, it's all recorded, so you can see how everything was done and how I got issues with something called Prettier and ESLint. But they're really cool tools, by the way. Really cool. All right, let's have a sneak peek into this. How does the application look like? It looks like this. Oh, it's not. Let me do a display mirror everything. 1 second. Nice. Okay, so this is the UI. I know this is going to be pretty boring for you because you're always smart, and then I'm the outlier here. But look at this. I have responsive. I've made it. Well, that's kind of a lie, because if you actually go to bookings, I know all the flaws. You see? I couldn't get that thing right place. But don't worry, this is again to show you how that looks like. So if I stop this and I'd say let's go to, now I'm gonna show the whole piece operating everything that you should know. So if I search for a flight on London Gatwick and Madrid, see how beautiful this is? I know this is city, but gosh, it took so long. I just imported one library, that's all. And then I have my flights in here. In fact, I even did filters so it would look real. I know. It's like, yeah, boring. It's like, oh god. I do this like in a night. So if I select one flight, why not 1,000 euros from London to Madrid? We don't need that cash anyway. So I should be able to add my name to it, my country, any postcode. I'm not doing any validation here from the payment side. I use a fake card, and then from here, I just do agree and pay now. See that? I know. So I charge a pre-authorization, and I should be able to receive an email. I'm not going to show my personal email address, but the whole point is you should be able to see a booking within a second or two. I'm actually in the process of designing a better UI to show you process of bookings now that I got something UI. But once that's logged in, I should be able to see my new booking. And then if I go to profile now, I should be able to see new points, which was 500, now to 600. So this is kind of the whole app. Gosh, it took so long to do all these things in HTML, etc. But how does it actually look from the backend side of things, right? So the first thing to look at the backend is, remember that booking process that you all saw it? I'm going to show you how we've just made a new booking now. Don't worry, you don't need to know every single detail that's happening here. When we kick off this thing here, we have a input that was passed to this whole state machine. We got the outbound flight ID, the booking table, and a bunch of other pieces that I got from here. From here, we have this Saga right here, which you probably remember from the presentation, right? I was able to reserve a flight. Everything went successfully. So this is the perfect world, which doesn't always happen. If I click in each of those, I should also be able to see what was the input and what was the input of each of those. So if I go to the last one, confirm booking, I even get to see what was the payment receipt that Stripe actually gave it to me. Everything within my state machine. This is when everything is perfect and nobody's complaining to you, everything is awesome. However, if I try and get the same flight and the same payment, which I know is not supposed to work, so if I try to do this and I capture the whole payment again, what happens is Stripe will say, hey, you already captured this payment, it shouldn't work. And this, you should be able to see the whole Saga piece. Did you see that yellow there now? Because it failed to collect payment, we went straight to cancel booking, flight, and everything else. If I go to my queue, I should now be seeing a big JSON payload, which I have more context into why it failed, which customer should I talk to, that sort of thing. That's fine when it's on one booking. How do I go further and troubleshoot something production ready? Remember the X-ray piece, the tracing piece? This is what just was traced. If my internet works really well, I will show you the tracing piece. I'll wait for the loading up. I'll go straight to the logs as well. This were, if you remember, this is a structure log from the charge ID, the customer ID. This is pretty much a console log with a lot more context that you normally would. And then I also see exactly what was the payment transaction, the Stripe came back to me, the headers, and everything else. I should also be able to query from this, but I'm going to spare you for that. So maybe I'm having some internet piece. Okay, it's going now. If I show the last 5 minutes, this is what tracing looks like. It's not going to be possible to see everything because it's too big, but I will show you one transaction so you can have an idea why annotating your code using labels, using a bunch of things looks like. You see that this red piece here? We got some problems here. I could even go and say, show me only the payments that got uncaptured or things like this. But let's just click here for now in one that failed. I should also see the distribution latency if I want to do performance testing. Again, too much for today. If I click in view on that particular trace, using annotation inside your code, which again I can show you offline because I don't want to go too deep, is you have context of your business on every transaction. What was the booking ID? What was the customer? If I say only show me the payment that failed, I now should be able to start concatenating things and search. Show me the payment that failed, which state machine that actually contributed to the whole process, what was the context, what was the customer, what was the table, what was the flight, etc., etc., etc. If I click on one of them, you're going to start seeing some interesting things. This is what trace looks like for you. So you should be able to see who initialized, what was the downstream service, where it failed, what was the message, what was the exception, what was its traceback, and things like this. So it's all coming into circle. Hopefully that gives an idea of what we've done on Twitch and also have an idea about both front ends and back ends in this full stack, whatever people call it. I call this a builder. So let's finish this and go to the piece I didn't tell you. I only told you the piece that worked. The first things first is I thought people were exaggerating about CSS. Like, yeah, come on, seriously. It cannot be that bad. There's a website called CSS Tricks, which I love it now, and the work that Sarah Dresner does. There's even something called Frontend Masters, which is like, I wish I knew that before. So CSS, if you haven't got the joke, you could see that the last piece, right? So it's difficult to fit in. But the joke was there, except I was laughing on other people until it was with me. So it's an easy trick, right? All you need to do in here is some list items and put everything into the right place. How hard can it be? So I find the right CSS position until I got this. This took me 5 hours. I don't have any shame on saying that. If you know what it is, I will give you a prize. I even give you special stickers for you. I asked web developers at Amazon and a bunch of other people who were like much higher degree than I have. And I thought, what's going on here? All I did was copy and paste the departure airport to arrival airport, and it changed to landing. What's happening here? Do you have any idea why that happened? Any like guesses? Okay, oh, you know everything, right? So, what's that? Right. Okay, it wasn't. We went there. We went to every possible obscure things. Like seriously, I even learned how to debug on Chrome and everything. I was like, oh my god. So what this was, what does that image tell you? The first one is taking off, right? The second is landing. Except that the flight icon, landing, was called flight land. And the ing, that space you see there, is an ing text in white color in a white background. Until I moved the CSS background to red, I know. See? I was like, I'm so stupid. Oh my God. I know. The second piece, which was, I thought was going to be one of the easiest piece, which was actually quite hard. I still couldn't figure out every piece. I asked one of my friends, is like, oh, how do I test this front end piece now? How do I test this view components and things like this? Easy. All you do is you do snapshot tests, like screenshots. Like, no, snapshot tests. Like, all I know is unit test, man. A unit test, integration test. That's what I know. And turns out there's a lot more into the UI, especially components calling subcomponents and things like this. I've got to be honest with you. I've read so many articles. Everything was so confused, so confusing to me. Everyone went straight to something. They couldn't really tell me why they were testing what they were testing. This book, on the other hand, if you were here in this conference, thank you. Like, thank you. This was actually clarified things to me on testing for frontend and testing Vue.js applications itself. I still haven't finished though, but this was to me, which was eye-opening. Oh, I see now why people use Cypress or Nighthawk or God knows the other names. There's so many. There are puppeteers as well. I use Cypress, so easiest. If you're interested in seeing this whole source code, even if it's not, it's going to be complete by December 1st, which I'm still doing the production piece of it, creating business KPIs and a bunch of metrics as well. I'm creating correlation IDs from the front end, which I now figured out the best way to do it. So feel free to watch it or create an issue or even talk to me directly. That's where the source code is. And either by December or by early next year, I'm also going to push the workshop that's based on this. If you're keen to actually get your hands into full stack from the very scratch beginning and get to this point, this is also going to be a workshop by early next year max. Summary of everything. Serverless makes it so much easier to get all of your ideas like that. I didn't do much coding. If I did 1,000 lines, that was it. Most of the lines was actually documenting, trying to learn ESDoc and all these pieces. But the reality is, every time you write code, it's your responsibility. You create liability. You are responsible for that. You're responsible for maintaining that, even legal pieces. If you're doing open source as well, everything is actually your responsibility. So the less code you write, the better. The more code you write for business that actually generates revenue or gets you customers, that's one of the best places to be. And what I found with the whole JavaScript community and frontend, which made me a better engineer, which I couldn't find words to better put this, is in organizations in my world that I live in, most of the time you have customers right here and you have developers right there. People try to do DevOps, all those sorts of things, and they get possibly in the middle. The one that we kind of, I think, underestimated is front-end. It's like here. It's one of the closest to the customer. And empowering front-end developers to understand the back-end that easy and getting back-ends to understand the front-end, how close to the customer it should be, it's actually liberating, seriously. So to me is focus on the business, serverless first if possible, and the rest Amplify makes it all easy for everything. And yeah, I don't need to teach you that. Using components for front ends and everything else. These were kind of my learnings, and also some of those pieces I hope you learned something from it. So thanks a lot for having me in my first ever JS community and also first JS conference. So thank you guys.
Thank you. We do have a few questions.
Okay. Oops.
Oops. Okay, so let's start with the obvious one. What was the biggest challenge you faced making this? Apart from
I know
ING.
you're gonna laugh. I mean, I didn't want to say that in public. So I tried Vue.js and I did something called Vue create whatever. It's like select a bunch of items. I want ESLint, I want TypeScript, I want that. That was like, oh my God, front-end and JavaScript have the best tooling ever. Never seen something like that. And we generated a bunch of different files and dot files, which I have no clue what they were. So Webpack, ESLint, Prettier, and all those things that gave me a huge headache until I understood how to configure. I'll give you an example that I was talking to Bobby the other day and was laughing. Is if I were to save my code in Visual Studio Code, ESLint would complain. If I saved again, prettier would complain. I was like, thanks. Shouldn't they be fixing each other? So like tooling itself was really hard. Webpack, everything I found about Webpack was you have an index.html, you have an index.js, everything should work. Like nothing worked. Backend was so much harder. After I tried a bunch of actual tutorials and trying that myself from scratch, I was like, oh, cool, I got it. And then most of my headaches were actually not configuring the tools to coexist together. So tooling was actually the hardest.
Okay, and the second one perhaps you already answered. It's what did you use for resolvers, lambdas or VTL?
I used both Lambda, VTL, and also HTTP resolvers. So loyalty, for instance, is AppSync straight to a REST API, no Lambda, no VTL involved. Anything to Dynamo that's easy logic or nothing really customized, straight VTL. Everything that I want to have key business impact or key business insight, Lambda.
Thanks. What are the advantages of using Amplify for mid to enterprise level apps?
So the first is that when you start with serverless or AWS, there's only 100 plus services. It's super easy to learn, right? Obviously it's not. So Amplify, the bits of that really, especially for front-end piece that I didn't know, is most of the best practices for setting up Dynamo, getting some of those structures in place, getting authentication, sign up, show, federation, or even if I wanted to, say that I want to search all my flights in full text search, I would have to have a DynamoDB streams or a stream to my database, set up a Lambda function, create an Elasticsearch cluster, create my index, and do all these bits in the correct order. If I use Amplify, I do what is the field I want to make full text. I add @searchable, and that's done. So those pieces actually help a lot from that sense.
Okay. Why is tracing your applications important?
Come again?
Why is tracing your applications important?
So if you ever worked with any microservices, when you only have an API, something that computes in a database, so easy. I mean, you don't really do much. Sometimes tracing will be an overkill. As you start adding more microservices, it's difficult for you to know what happens within those contexts or bounded contexts. Who caused the performance that you probably had? Was that you? Was that somebody else? Was that the internet? Those pieces are difficult. It's very difficult for you to have a clear vision of what's happening across all those systems. I was talking with Alec now, without naming any customer. One of my customers is going to production now in 2 weeks' time, and they got 1.6 thousand Lambda functions. So if you try to put that into just a CloudWatch metric to see what the latency is going to be like 300 milliseconds, and sometimes you see a spike, and you're like, where is that spike coming from? Good luck. If you don't have tracing or structure logging, you're on your own. If you have something that's really basic, like a simple web app that you don't do much calls with many different services, that's fine. As long as you start doing message between different microservices, multiple calls in between one another, asynchronous, synchronous, event-driven, without tracing, it's madness, seriously.
Okay, thanks. And the last question for today. Does X-Ray work with a Dockerized environment with an existing backend?
Sure, it does. So in serverless, all of that is taken care of for you. If you use on a Docker or EC2 or virtual machine, the way tracing actually works, X-Ray or open tracing, is you have to have a daemon running, listening on UDP port, and then your clients instrumenting your code send those traces. So if you're running on Docker, you set up a sidecar container on your Kubernetes cluster, whatever you use, and you run the X-Ray daemon right there, or open tracing, whatever, and that's how it works.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Avala.